Welcome back guys, and you'll be glad you clicked on this video because this is the video in which you learn everything all other CSS concepts are built from. In essence, this video is about the box model, and it should be self-explanatory why this video is the first tutorial in our series. It's simply because CSS uses the box model to control how elements are displayed. When we talk of the box model, many things come into picture, and we are going to be taking a look at all of them in this tutorial. HTML elements are of two main categories, block and inline elements. The element has some content, and the element can have a width and it can have a height. The element as well can have margin, padding or border, and these three are optional. If you are completely new to all of this, you'll be wondering, well, what is this guy really talking about? So hold on a second and I'm going to explain myself. The whole story starts with a box. You know, all HTML elements have some content. In most cases, this content is text. If you consider the HTML elements the button element, this is going to be the text in the button. And if it's a paragraph, this is going to be the text in the paragraph. The element can as well have some padding at the top, and remember the word can because this padding can as well be absent. The element can also have some padding at the bottom, and you are going to notice that this green portion around the content of this box is what is the padding, meaning that the element could as well have some padding at the left and some padding at the right, but in this case we just have padding at the top and bottom. The role of this padding is to separate the element content from the borders around the element. The element can as well have some margin to its left or some margin to its right. You also see that the margin can be at the top and at the bottom, and all this orange portion around the element is called the margin. The margin has as well to separate the element from all other elements on the page. So this is the box model, and the box model applies to all elements on a page. The width of the element is the horizontal distance from the left border of the element to the element's right border, while the height of the element is the vertical distance from the top border of the element to the bottom border of the element. Remember, in a previous slide I mentioned HTML elements can be separated into two main categories, inline and block elements. Well, block elements are simply elements which span the whole width of the screen. So you see, this is a block element spanning the whole width of the screen, while inline elements can stand side by side. So we have inline elements here, in this case three inline elements standing side by side. Of course, this is a coding channel and I'm not just going to be explaining slides. So let's hop into VS Code and you can practically understand what I've been explaining in these slides. So before we head into code and start programming, I would just like you to commit into memory these colors. The blue color is for the content area, the green is for the padding, and the orange is for the margin. So I've already gone ahead and opened the folder for the project, the box model. And in this folder, we just have two files. We have our index.html and our styles.css. Both of them are presently empty. Now, index.html is empty. We have the body, and I've opened our HTML file here in live server, so we have more content in the project for now. Since as we are going to be manipulating HTML and CSS in this tutorial, I would like the CSS file to be opened close to the HTML so that we can modify them at once. So in VS Code, it's possible to move your files to different positions on the screen. So I can move this CSS file to the bottom so that we see that CSS file is open here and we have the HTML open here, and we can manipulate both of them. So let's go ahead and create the first element to demonstrate the box model. So if we use a paragraph for now, and we see, let's give the paragraph some content. Let's just see the paragraph content. So if you come to your browser, you see the paragraph content, and well, you'll be wondering where is the box he was showing in the previous slide. Well, we cannot see the box. By default, the box is not visible because we are giving this content no background color, neither have we given this content some border. So the way you can see the box around this content is with the help of Chrome. So Chrome permits you inspect the content on a website. And inspecting this content on a website, if you hover over the particular element in the body, so you see that if I hover over this paragraph, it shows me the box model around the paragraph. You remember the blue portion I showed in the previous tutorial, in the previous slide? That blue portion is the content for our paragraph. And you see that a paragraph by default comes with some margin at the top and bottom. And as we saw, the margin is the orange portion around the content. So you see that paragraphs come with some content, which is the blue portion, and the margin at the top and bottom of the paragraph. The paragraph is a block element because you see that the paragraph by default spans the whole width of the web page. See that in your browser, the paragraph takes from the left to the right, so it fills the whole portion of the web page. It's a block element. There are many other block elements which we can also see, like the H1, H2, H3 up to H5. So if we give the H1 for example and say the H1, the heading 1 content. If you come back to our browser, you see that we have an H1, and the H1 as well is a block element because it covers the whole width of the browser. So it goes to the next line because this paragraph covers the first line. The H1, which is a block element, is going to move to the next line. It has a content as well, which is this blue portion we see, and it has margin at the top and bottom, which is the orange portion at the top and bottom of the heading. So you could be wondering why the browser actually gives some margin and padding to elements when you have not specified them. And the reason why it does that is because see that when you give a paragraph and you want to put a heading, the margin is what is going to help us separate the content from one HTML element from the next. So it gives us that clean look on our web page. You have the paragraph at the top, and the margin is what is separating the paragraph from the next element. There's another type of block element called the div, and the div is a block element which is special, and we're going to take a look at why the div is special. So if we just go and create the div element and give it some content, the div content. So if we create this div element and we give it some content, the div content, and we go back to our browser, you see that this div has just the content spanning the whole width of the browser. So it's a block element because it spans the whole width of the browser, but it has no margin at its top and bottom like we see with the H1s, which have margins at their top and bottom, and the paragraph. The div has no margin at its top and bottom. The other category of elements, known as the inline elements. Unlike block elements, inline elements are going to stand next to each other so long as there is horizontal space in the browser. Examples of inline elements are the button and the anchor elements. So if we create different buttons here, just see button, content. Let's create another button. We're going to call this one button 2. Then let's create 2 anchor elements. Giving no href, and let's just say anchor content, and let's call the next one anchor 2. That's anchor 2. So if we take a look now in our browser, what we notice is the next button goes after the first button, and the 2 anchor elements stand next to each other. Unlike we saw the block elements, the paragraphs, and the divs, these other inline elements, the button and anchor elements, stand next to each other, and it's because they are inline elements. So if you hover over their content here, you see that the button is just simply the button. The anchor element is just that anchor element. It does not span the whole width of the web browser. Unlike if we hover over the div, you see that the div spans the whole width of the browser. The H1 spans the whole width, and the paragraph also spans the whole width. So that's the difference between block and inline elements. The block elements are going to fill the whole width of the browser and are going to force a new line for each new block element, while the inline elements are going to stand next to each other so long as there is horizontal space on the browser. See that if we reduce the browser screen, you see that we force this new anchor element to go to the next line because there is no longer enough space on this line. And if we consider reducing the browser screen, you see that we can force more elements to go to new lines. And that's how block elements, inline elements behave. They are going to stand next to each other if there is more space on the browser, if there is horizontal space for them. But if there is no space, they are going to go to the next line. So let's go ahead and take a better look at the box model using just one element. So I'm going to take away all these other elements we saw previously, and I'm going to use the div element. Let's just say the div content. So in this case, I'm using the div element because, as we saw, the div element comes with no margin and padding around it. So the div element is just the content in it, which is this blue portion. We saw that the other block elements, the headings and paragraphs, came with margin around them. So let's use the div element that comes with no margin so that we can clearly demonstrate the box model. But all the code I'm going to be using for this div element is going to work for all the other HTML elements, which are block elements as well. So this div content, this is the content area, which is this blue portion. But this content area is actually surrounded by an invisible border, which we can make visible. If you go to our CSS and add the border rules to make it visible. So we're going to come to our CSS and we're going to target this div. So if we target the div and give the div a border, we want the border to be visible around the div. We want a black border, so we're going to give it a border color of black. Presently, the border is not also visible because the border has no width. It has a width of 0. So we can give the border a width. We can give the border a width of, let's just say 1 pixel, just to make it visible. And we can also give the border style. The border can have many styles. Let's give the border a style, in this case, of solid. So if we save now and come, you see now that this portion around the div content is what is called a border. So with the border now visible, we can explain the other properties of the box model. So we want this div content to have some padding at its top, bottom, left and right, so that it takes it away from the border. So you can specify properties here. Padding top. Let's give it a padding top of 50 pixels. If we take a look now in our browser, we see that the div content goes away from the top of the border because we gave it a padding at the top. We can give it a similar padding at the bottom of 50 pixels. Bottom. And if you take a look in our browser, we see now that the div is centralized vertically because we gave the same padding at top and bottom. And if you take a look, if you hover over the div in the Chrome Dev tool, so you notice the green portion now above the div content at the top and bottom is actually 50 pixels. And this green portion is there, as we saw in the previous slide. The green indicates the padding, and that's the 50 pixels we gave to this div in this case. We can also give some padding at the left and right, so that we're also going to get that green portion at the left and right of the div. So if we duplicate this line down and we give left and we give also a padding right. If you take a look in our browser now, if you hover over the div, you now notice the green portion surrounding the div content is the padding, and that's the same thing we saw in the previous slide. So that's the padding of an element using the box model. We can apply this same padding property to all other HTML elements and it's going to behave the same. The padding now is helping us separate this content from the borders of the HTML element itself. If you give an HTML element a background color, the background color is going to be inside the border of the element. So if we decide to give this element a background color of, let's say, blue, if you take a look now in your browser, you see that this blue color is inside the border of the element. So the background color of an element surrounds the element content. So that's another thing you can take note of. So let's just take away the background color and things go back to normal. So another box model property we can work with is the margin. Presently, we just see padding around this div HTML element, and it's because we have specified only padding around the element. We can also specify margin around this div element. And as we saw in the previous tutorial, as we saw in the previous slide, previous examples, the margin is going to separate the element from the surroundings of the element. So if we give some margin, it's going to separate this element from its surroundings. Let's take a look here. If we give a margin top of 20, let's just say 50 pixels as well. Well, you notice now that this element, if you hover over the div here, you see this orange portion around the div element. As we saw, the orange represents the margin, and in this case we have just given the margin of 50 pixels at its top. So that orange portion around the div is the margin. We can as well give margin at its bottom, left and right. So if you give margin as well here, so give a margin at the bottom. If you take a look now, hover over, you see that we have margin at the bottom. We can give margin also at the left, margin, yes, we have to be using left of 50 pixels as well, and margin at the right. Yeah, margin at the right. So if we take now a look in our browser, if we hover over this div, we see now margin surrounding it. So that orange portion surrounding the div, at its top, at its bottom, at its left and its right are the margins we just give to the element. And if you have doubts on the exact values of these divs and paddings, because the padding is the green portion while the margin is the orange portion, so if you have doubts on it, you can come to these dev tools. If you come to this computed tab and you take a look here, see that when you hover over a portion, this green portion, which is the padding, is actually highlighted on your browser. And if you hover over the margin, which is the orange portion, it's also highlighted on your browser. If you hover over the content, it's the blue portion, which is also highlighted on your browser, and you get the values here. You see this 50 is the value for the padding at the top, the value for the bottom 50, left and right. And it's the same for the margin. You have 50 at the top, 50 at the bottom, 50 at the left and 50 at the right. So you see that Chrome DevTools actually helps you see all these values. So there is one trick which is like a shorthand of specifying either padding top, bottom, left and right, or margin top, bottom, left and right at once. So if you want to be able to specify, give the same value for the padding around an element, what you can do is, instead of giving padding top, bottom, left and right to be the same value, you can just replace this property with just one property, which is padding. So if I cut this, if I say padding, if I just give padding and I say 50, just using this single property padding without specifying the particular portion you want to apply the padding to, you automatically interpret it as adding padding to the top, bottom, left and right of 50 pixels. So if we take a look in our browser, you notice that we'll still get that padding, that green portion around the content is the padding, and it's applied to the top, bottom, left and right. We can do the same thing for the margin. Instead of specifying margin top, left and right to 50, we can remove this and just give a margin of 50 pixels. And if we take a look, we see that we still get that margin, which is the orange portion around the content, 50 pixels all around it. So that's the box model applied to a block element. Let's try applying the box model to an inline element, and we're going to notice just a single difference. The margin at the top and bottom are not applied to inline elements. As we saw in the previous example, an example of an inline element is the anchor element. So if we use the anchor element, which is an example of an inline element, and just see here the anchor content. If we come to our browser, we see this anchor element, and if you hover over it in our body, we see that it just has the content, which is that blue portion it shows us when we hover over it. So let's give this anchor element some border around it, so that we don't need to hover over it to see the border like we see with the div content. So let's just copy the styles here and give it some border, or let's just apply the same styles to the anchor element. And the way we can do it is using a comma here and the anchor element. So by doing this, it means we're applying the same styles to the div and anchor element. We're applying all these styles to the div and anchor element. What we are going to notice is that the margin at the top and bottom is not going to apply to the anchor element because it's an inline element. So if you come back here and we hover over the anchor element, you notice that the anchor element only has margin at its left and right. It has no margin at its top and bottom. And it's unlike the div element that has the margin at its top, bottom, left and right. So that's the difference between inline and block elements. Inline elements don't respect the box model for margin at their top and bottom, but they respect all other properties. So that if we hover over the anchor element, we still get the padding around it, which is the green portion, padding at its top, bottom, left and right, but the margin is applied only to its left and right, not to its top and bottom. In contrary to inline elements, there's another kind of inline element, which is it's midway between inline and block. So it's inline block, and an example of it is the button HTML element. The inline block elements actually respect the box model. So if we take an example of an inline block element is the button element. So if you take button and just say button content, what we'll do now is we are going to give this button the same style as the div button. So you are going to notice that the button is going to respect the box model because it's going to get that padding margin around it. So if you go back, notice that the button now is taken away from the div because of that margin which is around it. And if you hover over the button, you see the button getting that green portion around it, which is the margin, the padding, and the orange portion around it, which is the margin. So inline block elements respect the box model. And the good thing with inline block elements is you can still put one inline element next to the other. A button element which is an inline block element, you can get another button element next to another. So it actually respects the box model with the advantage that it can get another element near it. The div elements, in contrary, can have only one div element on a particular row. So what do I mean by that? If I create another button here, let's just call this one button 2. Let's call this one button 2. So what you notice is, okay, the button 1 and button 2 are far away from each other because the space next to the button 2 does not permit the space next to button content does not permit button 2 to stand near it. So if I increase the browser width, notice that button 1 and button 2 can stand next to each other because they are inline elements. That's something which is impossible for block elements, because no matter how you increase the width of the browser, a box element is always going to grow to fill the width of the browser. But inline elements and inline block elements can stand next to each other. So guys, that's it for this tutorial, and just a summary using this image of the box model. Remember that the padding is this the content, the element content is this portion, the blue portion, and it's where the content of the element is going to go. The element can have some padding at its top, bottom, left, or right, and all these padding values are optional. Means the developer is the one to specify which padding values he wants for the padding at the top, bottom, left, or right, and the padding is this green portion around the element. The element can be separated from its content using margin, and the margin is going to be out of the border of the element. So you have the margin can be at the left, it can be at the right, top or bottom, and we are still the ones to specify the values we want for the margin, meaning that the element can exist without padding or margin, and we're just going to have this content area. As we saw when hovering over the div just had the content area, which is this blue portion. We also remember that some HTML elements like the h1 and the paragraph, the headings and paragraphs, come by default with margin around them. So they come by default with margin at their top and bottom. We also talked about block and inline elements, and we saw that block elements are always going to grow to fill the width of the browser. If the browser width is small, they are going to take up that small space, and if you expand the browser, they are going to take up the full space on the browser. So block elements can never stand next to each other on the same row. Block elements will always be vertically one above the other. But we also saw inline elements, and we saw that inline elements can stand next to each other given that there is space on the browser. So if you have enough horizontal space, an inline element is going to stand next to each other. But if there is no space, the inline element is going to go to the next line. We saw that there are two kinds of inline and block elements. There is an intermediary type, which is the inline block element. We saw that the box model applies to block elements, so they can have margin at their top, bottom, left, and right. But for inline elements, the box model is not going to completely apply to them, because inline elements cannot have margin at their top and bottom. They have margin only at their left and right. We saw that the alternative, which was inline block elements, follow the box model. In addition to being able to have one content next to each other, as we saw with the buttons, the inline block elements also support the box model. So with inline block elements, you could still have margin around the element. So guys, that's it for this tutorial. If there's anything you didn't understand, just go ahead and leave a comment and I'll respond to you. And if you made it far to the end of this tutorial, just go ahead and click that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.